the final keynote of ISPP 2018. And I also want to thank you all for helping to make this conference such a success. Having gone to panels and seen some posters, I'm just continually impressed by both the quality of the work that's being presented here and the engagement of the participants and the audiences around the work. That's what makes for an exciting conference, and that's, as a program chair, I'm speaking on behalf of Frank and myself. We just want to thank you all for making this a successful conference. I'm very, very pleased to welcome our final keynote speaker. I want to say a few words about him first. Donald Halder-Markel is professor and chair of political science at the University of Kansas. He works on the representation of interests in the policy process and the dynamic between public opinion, political behavior, and public policy. He's published 60 peer-reviewed articles. That just makes me tired. Including in our flagship journal, Political Psychology. He's also published several books. His research focuses on civil rights, race and inequality, environmental politics, among other topics. He's currently working with a team studying gun politics in the US. For those of you who are from other countries, you may want to look at some of this research when you think, why are Americans so weird? Just a tip. And there are many things that make us weird. That's just one of them. And he's also working with a team on transgender politics and policy. He has a book forthcoming in September on the remarkable rise of transgender rights, available in September. And I also want to make a note about the importance of this particular research in this context of our politics, both in the United States, more broadly in the world, and very close to home in Texas. This is an area in which we've seen tremendous movement forward and some pretty scary movements back, and that really hit close to home for me in the context of Texas, when we're welcoming you all from all over the world, and we suddenly are hit with controversy over a bathroom bill, over exclusionary politics as applied to LGBT community members in relation to whether or not they can adopt. And it's also within that particular context, in addition to the remarkable scholarship you've done, but within that particular context that we really value hearing from you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and Bethany, and thank you all for attending today. I'm really pleased to be here in San Antonio. The last time I was in San Antonio, I was viewing Halley's Comet from Lackland Air Force Base back in January of 1986, so it's been a little while. Happy to be back. I'm happy to chat with you today about political psychology and LGBT politics and policy. I will say from the beginning, sometimes I tend to go a little fast, so if there's something really confusing to you and you feel like interrupting, please raise your hand. I'm happy to try to answer a question in the middle. Otherwise, we can field questions at the end. What I want to do today is contextualize a little bit how political psychology has helped to inform our understandings of LGBT politics and policy. And if we really look at the modern gay and lesbian LGBT movement in the United States, we can really date it from the uprising at the Stonewall Inn in New York City in 1969, and perhaps even more appropriately, to some extent, the 1973 American Psychiatric Association decision to remove homosexuality from the DSM-II, to a great extent, really kind of kick off the modern LGBT movement. Certainly there's a history before that. Certainly there's a history you can trace in other countries that's just as important and relevant. But that, in a sense, comes about the same time that, at least for political scientists interested in psychology and psychological theories, the two kind of come together there in the 1970s. So I'd like to highlight some of the contributions that I've observed, both in the literature and some of my own work. But this is by no means comprehensive, and I'm not being exclusionary for any particular reason other than I needed to sort of focus down on a few key things that I think are especially relevant, especially where it overlaps with my work, and then talk about what I think are some of the future directions researchers can go in. What I want to do first is kind of give you a baseline. If we really think what's most relevant, what political psychology theories and existing empirical work are most important for the study of LGBT politics, we can think really we're primarily talking about public opinion and political behavior. And as a baseline to sort of see where, how people feel about LGBT people, I wanted to give you a sense from a survey we did in 2016, a national survey of Americans, the basic feeling thermometer question, where people put gays and lesbians and transgender people relative to other groups in American society. So I know this isn't that large, but right about in the middle here at about 53.4 or 53.5 on the feeling thermometer is the average score for gays and lesbians in 2016 amongst American adults. Transgender people fall just below that. It's the next group below that at 46%, about the same as Christian fundamentalists. So below the 50% mark, but certainly higher than Democrats, rich people, the NRA, Republicans, Muslims, atheists, and the Tea Party. So in that sense, they fall in about in the middle, with transgender people a little bit below gays and lesbians below gun owners, interracial couples, police, scientists, and veterans, which are rated pretty positively. So with that sort of baseline, of course, then we want to know, well, who's more likely to have warm feelings, who's more likely to have cold feelings? And that's where we can kind of get a baseline model which we can predict at least existing categories of people, who's more likely to be supportive, who's more likely to oppose. And from what we know from years of research looking at feelings towards the LGBT community as well as support for LGBT policies, we know that more positive affect, more comfort, and more support for LGBT rights can be found amongst women, liberals, Democrats, younger people, the more educated, those living in urban areas, those with less stringent religious affiliations, and to some extent, white people, but that's kind of a mixed finding. So from that baseline, we can really say then, what does political psychology have to offer above and beyond the sort of group categories that we can come up with? So what I'd like to focus on for this talk are really sort of what we can find in sort of research on personality, worldviews, and values, as well as from social identity theory, attribution theory, contact theory and parasocial contact, issue framing and perspective taking, as well as new directions. So when we first look at personality, we can think of first the big 5 personality traits. There's actually surprisingly a little amount of research looking at big 5 personality traits and attitudes towards the LGBT community or LGBT rights. Most of what exists tends to scale together questions about LGBT rights with other social issues like abortion or gun control, and then look for correlations or associations between certain personality traits and those types of issues. Gerber is one example of this. From what appears to be out there, mostly what the strongest links are with personality traits of openness to experience is associated with liberal social attitudes, and conscientiousness being associated with conservative social attitudes. And you can see that the other main 3 personality traits are linked to general political attitudes like ideology or partisan ID, but aren't specifically linked to attitudes on LGBT rights. Now, arguably, we might also suggest that some personality traits that are designated as such, other people would suggest are worldviews, are social dominance orientation and religious personality. Those are both found to be strongly associated with support for gay rights, with social dominance orientation personalities having a negative association with support for gay rights, and religious personalities having a negative association with gay rights. The one area that I think gets a little less studied or had been less studied until the last few years, tended to be authoritarianism. With the earlier sort of heyday period, there was some research on LGBT politics that explored authoritarian personalities and as a predictor of prejudice and homophobia, including Herrick's early work back in 1988. But others since then have also found some associations overall with support for gay rights, and then more recently as a predictor of transphobia, not only in the general population, but also amongst gays and lesbians, which is an important point for some of the things I'll bring up later, because even things like transphobia that you find in the general population, even within the LGBT community, there is a certain degree of transphobia there as well. There is some debate in the literature over whether or not you use terms like gay and lesbian or homosexual for the results you find. For example, Rios found that there is authoritarianism is associated with prejudice against homosexuals, but not prejudice against gays and lesbians. Others refute that kind of finding. And it also, as I mentioned, correlates with anti-transgender attitudes, which my team has found in recent research. I think a related trait, and arguably would fit as a personality characteristic under here, is disgust sensitivity. And this is something that I think increasingly in psychology you see being used more often, to some extent in sociology, but really has been a relatively understudied area in political psychology as a trait, other than being correlated with conservatism and authoritarianism in general, but looking at attitudes towards specific groups and the rights of those groups hasn't been used that often. But recent research has in fact found this, and I wanted to give you some examples of this as well. And I know this table is going to be really small, but one reason I want to put it up here is because these models basically looking at support for transgender civil rights in one dimension over a series of questions here on the left, and then over attitudes on sort of body-centric dimensions about things like transgender people using the bathrooms that are consistent with their gender identity. If you model those using these standard kind of predictors we talked about earlier, including age, partisanship, church attendance, and things like that, as well as things like authoritarianism, you'll find disgust sensitivity is a really powerful additional predictor to these attitudes. So even controlling for these known correlates, and even controlling for other personality traits like authoritarianism, which we know is itself correlated with disgust sensitivity, we still see a very powerful independent effect of this variable. So I think it's worthwhile to consider going forward measures of disgust sensitivity in a relatively simple 4-question scale for this kind of research. Likewise, a sort of contrasting view to these personality traits might be these general worldviews that we often look at with these issues, including traditionalism or traditional moral values and egalitarianism. And again, in a simple model looking on transgender issues, controlling for basic individual characteristics such as race, gender, partisan identification, religious attendance, and things like that, we can account for authoritarianism, egalitarianism, disgust sensitivity, and moral traditionalism, and all those factors are significant predictors for transgender civil rights and gay and lesbian civil rights. Interestingly, the authoritarian, once you control for these sort of worldviews or values, authoritarianism drops out of these models on those basic bathroom kinds of questions that we just mentioned on gender identity. So there's those, and I think that's sort of a big chunk and a non-trivial chunk of this research. I kind of came at a lot of this stuff in the beginning from social identity theory, in particular with a focus on groups, not only in the policy process, but also groups in society and the mobilization of groups in society. And I think you can divide up much of the social identity literature into sort of two ways it's employed or deployed into understanding LGBT politics. Of course, one way would simply to be look at LGBT identity as a social identity, as a political identity. Those fitting the standard ideas of sense of belongingness, shared fate, and perceived discrimination amongst group members. So there's that. But of course, there's a more broad way to look at this, and that is in terms of social identities theory's perspective on in-groups versus out-groups. And if we look at things like party identification, for example, and consider that a social identity instead of the traditional ways we've kind of looked at it, you can see that with the LGBT community sort of aligned itself with the Democratic Party, that's seen as an in-group within the Democratic Party, that comes to sort of then predict attitudes of Democrats towards the LGBT community, as well as Republicans who will see that as an out-group not affiliated with their party. So I just wanted to give you a few examples of each of these. There's been a really limited empirical application of social identity theory to social identity amongst LGBT people. As you might expect, this is partly because it's really difficult to get a reasonable probability sample of LGBT people. Recently, both Gallup and the Pew Research Organization have done a better job of spending a lot of money to get oversamples of the LGBT community, enough so that analysis can be done, and that data has been made public, in particular by the Pew Research Center from a 2013 survey. So those are useful now, but for the most part, earlier studies largely looked at small groups of people or used snowball samples to get any sense of LGBT group identity. And many of those only looked at one portion of identity, such as belongingness or perceived discrimination. One example I just wanted to throw up here real quick was from a chapter we just completed as part of a critical read around LGBT politics, where we used that Pew 2013 data to basically look at differences in the LGBT community in support for some of the priority policy areas that the movement has pursued. For example, equal marriage rights and adoption rights for LGBT people. And what's interesting about that, first of all, there is variation. Not everybody has the same idea about that. And in fact, these typical measures of identity, for example, whether or not being LGBT matters to you, matters to your own personal identity, whether you have a sense of linked fate with the LGBT community, and whether or not you perceive discrimination against the group, all are factors in predicting your attitudes on these specific movement priorities. And that's accounting for partisanship, age, all the other kinds of standard things. So it is a powerful and important predictor of LGBT attitudes, and other research shows also of LGBT political behavior, including mobilization, participation in protests, and things like that. I wanted to give you kind of an interesting example within the sort of thinking of the in-group, out-group, because this has been a sort of little stone in my shoe recently. I was interested in this question of enumeracy, both in the issue for the LGBT community, but also in my research on gun owners, because it turns out that at least Americans are very bad at estimating the size of group populations. So if we ask people, how many people in the United States are Latino? How many people in the United States or what percentage of the population is African American or Muslim? No matter what group you ask about for those minority groups, Americans on average will say somewhere around 23, 24% of the population belongs to those groups. You can also ask the question, out of 100 people, how many would be, is another nice way to sort of ask people. Well, it turns out that we're really bad at that. And for a long time, researchers in this small subset area, including John Sides and others, have sort of approached this whole question of, if we perceive groups as a threat, we'll estimate the size of the group higher as an explanation for why do people think there are so many Latinos in the United States? Why do people think there are so many African Americans? We saw it as they must be seeing a threat, so they're overestimating. Well, it turns out when you actually look at predictors of who's more likely to overestimate the size of these groups, it's not groups likely to see them as a threat. So, for example, Republicans and conservatives are not the ones overestimating the size of these minority groups. And the same is true with gays and lesbians. We see overestimates of the group, but it's not who you might think it is. It's in fact groups you might think to be part of the in-group with gays and lesbians. People who have positive attitudes, for example, gay people, women, are more likely to think the group is larger. Ironically, even though that is the case, once you account for what a person's estimate is of the size of the group, and then use that to predict their support for various policies, you find that threat does seem to operationalize itself to some extent there. In other words, if I perceive the group as larger, on average, I will give less support for equal rights for that group. And this is true for gays and lesbians as well, that if I perceive the group as larger, I'm less likely to support equal employment protections for the LGBT community, legal same-sex marriage. I'm also, to some extent, less likely to think people are born with their sexual orientation. So that's sort of a little aside. So that brings me to attribution theory. So this is kind of my favorite one, partly because when I went to the University of Kansas, I found out that a psychologist, also named Halder, but spelled differently, developed this attribution theory back in the 1950s. And people's interest in attribution theory had kind of declined over the years, and psychologists had mostly begun to focus on sort of attributions in interpersonal relationships and interpersonal communications. And it was less sort of interesting for politics over time. But I found it incredibly interesting because when you look at the classic cases of thinking about, like, if I see a homeless person in the street, do I think that person is homeless because of the decisions they've made in their own personal life, or do I think that they're homeless because of broader forces that they have no control over? What is the outcome that you see? And no matter what kinds of studies you do like this, you tend to find that, for example, liberals and conservatives make different kinds of attributions. Democrats and Republicans tend to make different kinds of attributions. Now, we know there's a fundamental attribution error, that generally speaking, we default to sort of blaming the individual about anything. That's what most people will do, especially if the question doesn't involve us personally. Then it's like, I just blame you. So we know that exists. What's interesting, and what we uncovered over time in a series of projects, we uncovered the fact that if we look back in time at attributions for something like homosexuality, do you think it's something people are born with, or is it a function of the environment, or something people choose? You see that as far back as this question was asked in 1977, if we look at Democrats, Independents, and Republicans, they made exactly the same attributions back in 1977. And then what this graph shows is over time, with independents kind of in the middle, Democrats, the triangles on the top, and Republicans on the bottom, that there was a divergence in making this kind of attribution. In other words, Democrats were more likely to say this is something people were born with. Independents kind of followed Democrats on the upward trend, and Republicans split off and kind of went their own way. And this became a sort of fascinating question to me, is sort of like, how did this happen? So we have a whole paper on this, but it's this idea that attributions themselves, or the causes of things, can be politicized, at least once a broader issue involving this group becomes politicized, is entirely possible. So I think attribution theory is really important in this regard. On top of the fact that we can show that partisan split, we can also show then making one attribution versus another strongly influences your preferences on LGBT policy issues. This is just a correlation example showing over time a belief that homosexuality is something people are born with, and support for same-sex marriage. You see that those are strongly correlated over time. That holds up in a multivariate model as well. And I think it's applicable to lots of these issues, and I'll mention at the end, there's already people beginning research on looking at gender identity and transgender people to see if gender identity itself is something that people think is biological or attributed to something in the broader environment. Okay. The other favorite, contact theory and parasocial contact. Parasocial contact's become my new my new pet favorite, just because it's fun. But it's worthwhile remembering when thinking about contact theory, which itself dates back to the 1950s, but then in the 1970s, as the modern LGBT movement was being mobilized, and the movement was kind of split between what you might call a sort of assimilationist portion of the movement and a liberationist portion of the movement, that there was a debate to some extent, but increasing calls that people in the movement need to come out publicly to their families, to their friends, to the people that they work with, as a way to raise political consciousness about LGBT people. And what they were effectively arguing was for contact theory. What they were doing was saying that greater contact, when people know somebody that's LGBT, they will develop more positive attitudes. That's the whole point of this. Now, beyond that, you can say, well, the liberation portion of the movement wanted to argue, you know, coming out is a political act, and they want to say it's all more than that, but it really feeds into specific contact theory. And what we saw, we don't have great data before 1990, but what we saw here, this sort of graphs, do you know somebody who is gay or lesbian? Is somebody in your family gay or lesbian, or a friend or acquaintance? And on top, the top line shows the percentage of people with an acquaintance who's gay or lesbian. The middle line is work with somebody who is gay or lesbian, and then a family member. Now, of course, this has increased over time, and we can't really know what it was like in the 70s or 1980s because we don't have great data on that, but it's definitely increased over time, with greater contact occurring, especially for friends and acquaintances. To a lesser extent, this is also true for transgender people. And this is just asking about a friend or acquaintance or a family member and not somebody you work with the sort of X's being the close friend and the O's being an acquaintance here on this graph. And with only more recent data, actually the most recent data you can find on this would be 2011, asking whether or not you've had this kind of contact. Turns out this is a really powerful predictor of attitudes or affect towards gays and lesbians as well as transgender people and support for LGBT rights. That even accounting for many of the things we've already talked about, authoritarianism, disgust sensitivity, as well as basic individual characteristics, that contact, interpersonal contact with LGBT people increases positive affect towards transgender people as well as towards gays and lesbians, and even willingness to vote for LGBT candidates. Now, what's interesting, I just want to backtrack to this, and again, I know these are small, but what's really interesting about this and important to the broader work that we've been doing on the transgender movement is that contact with gay and lesbian people also increases affect towards transgender people. There's not a lot in reverse. In other words, contact with transgender people doesn't really increase that much affect towards gays and lesbians, but that's really an important aspect about coalition building and the importance of this overall contact argument. Now, there is, of course, a problem. There is, of course, a problem with contact theory that some of you may be fully aware of. That especially when you're talking about a group, then it essentially can hide its identity. That who that members of that group choose to out themselves to is partly dependent on their perceptions of those individuals, right? So if somebody comes out to their friend, it's partly because of how they might think their friend might react. So whether or not contact theory is really working the way we think here, that contact is increasing positive attitudes towards LGBT people, or whether or not LGBT people are just coming out to people that already have positive attitudes, is kind of a dilemma in this research. Pat Egan has done some research that hasn't been published yet, I don't know why, that actually shows that you can isolate this effect. There is an independent effect here, although it's also true that LGBT people are more likely to come out to friends, family, and coworkers that are more positive towards LGBT people. There is still an independent contact effect that's real. So the parasocial contact part of this, or as some people have sort of phrased it, the will and grace effect, or the queer eye queer eye for the straight guy effect. For a long time, there was a big sort of broader understanding that, you know, all this change in popular culture that began to happen in the 1990s with positive representations of gay people with gay characters on sitcoms and movies, etc., and then kind of culminating with Ellen coming out on her TV show and then the creation of Will and Grace, as well as Queer Eye with the Straight Guy, must have played a role in the dramatic positive increase in attitudes towards LGBT people and LGBT rights. But nobody had really done much to establish this. Now, there was some research in psychology, a few published articles that began to establish there is this parasocial contact effect. That if we have contact theory to suggest, well, friends and family who are LGBT, that might increase positive affect and positive support for LGBT rights. Well, seeing representations of gay people or feeling like you know somebody, even if you don't directly know them, but a character on a show you watch, for example, that might have a similar sort of bleed-over effect. And in fact, it appears to be the case. So Gerritson's, I think, really done some of the most premier work on this, both with his recent book, but also with some articles where he can show, especially amongst younger Americans, a really positive impact of this parasocial contact or the influence of gay LGBT characters in popular culture having a really positive effect. I was interested in it more recently because with Caitlyn Jenner's sort of self-outing in 2015, it provided a really dramatic moment that was not really comparable to anything else we'd seen. In other words, what we had here was a very public figure, at least from the 1970s, you know, a more recent sort of public face as well, but at least from the 1970s, that many older Americans knew Jenner as this semi-national hero and as ultimately a very masculine representation of American sort of ethos, right? So it's sort of, anybody would know, any older American would know who Jenner was. And all of a sudden you have this moment where Jenner says, well, I'm no longer going to go by the name Bruce, I'm going to go by the new name Caitlyn. So I'm going to throw all this past upside down. Now you have to see me in a completely new light. And to some extent, well, how does that then make people feel about transgender people or the notion of transgender identity? And we did ask a series of limited questions about this in a national survey we did in 2015, just after Caitlyn Jenner appeared on the Vanity Fair cover in May, I believe that was May 2015. And what was really interesting about this is what we kind of anticipated, that really this shouldn't really impact young people very much because they don't really have a sense of Jenner as that Olympian. They have a sort of sense of Jenner, maybe with, I guess, I don't know if it was, I forget all the popular culture references. I don't watch any of those shows. So anyway, there are some popular culture references that Jenner's in, but mostly they didn't have that association with Jenner on the Wheaties box, right? They have this other association. So we thought the effect might be greatest in at least reducing transphobia amongst older Americans, at least reducing the effects of transphobia. And it turns out that's true, that Jenner's case actually helps to reduce the effects of transphobia amongst older Americans. So this is sort of an interesting, unique case of parasocial contact that is not going to be easy to replicate by any means, but it's really an interesting extension of the idea. Beyond that, parasocial contact, there is the sort of mere exposure idea, that if direct contact makes a difference, okay, well, if parasocial contact through popular culture and seeing characters you know makes a difference, well, what about just sort of giving people information and exposing them directly to, for example, transgender people? Does that have an effect? Well, we've got two papers that actually looked at this question and find that people actually, even in cases where, for example, we tried to test this gender congruency and incongruency and look at whether or not, okay, well, it's not just exposure to like a picture of a transgender person, but let's say a female identifying transgender person that still kind of has male attributes, or a male identified transgender person that sort of still has female attributes, maybe the effect wouldn't be so positive then. But our research actually finds in an experiment embedded in a national survey that in fact simple exposure or mere exposure to information and images of transgender people increase positive affect towards transgender people. So that, I think it's a further step in suggesting this portion of contact theory is a really powerful one. I wanted to highlight just a couple of things about issue framing and issue priming, but really get to a key new theory that I think is really important for this area. Issue framing, of course, is the notion that any issue can be presented on one dimension versus some other dimension, that every issue has multiple dimensions, that presenting an issue on one dimension versus another might shape attitudes towards that issue. We could also specifically prime or activate existing attitudes, values, or identities with language, images, or in some kind of context. And there is a fair amount of relevant literature on LGBT politics in issue framing and issue priming, and I just want to give you a couple examples. Paul Brewer had done some research looking at the framing of the public discourse of framing LGBT issues as egalitarian or moral traditionalism, and then testing the notion of knowledge with the simple idea that the most informed members of the public would be most affected by these discourses on moral traditionalism, egalitarianism, and have their attitudes more directly affected. And this is basically what he finds. The high knowledge people are more strongly affected by essentially these frames of egalitarianism versus moral traditionalism, both on questions of LGBT rights as well as on affect towards LGBT people. Tesler had done a study where he specifically suggested that the positions that President Bush took on same-sex marriage in 2003 and 2004 helped prime issues or affect towards LGBT people, and subsequently this influenced attitudes towards President Bush, and he's able to demonstrate that with panel data from that period as well. But I think really the most interesting development in this area has been the work of Harrison and Michelson, and they've done a couple of articles, and then they have their new book from 2017, We Need to Talk, which is they lay out a whole series of experiments where they test out this idea. And what their theory is really brings together a couple of different things. It brings together priming, it brings together social identity, and it brings together motivated reasoning. And what they basically argue is that functionally, if we hear a typical framing message, to say, President Obama has this opinion on this issue, that then basically is priming us by being President Obama and our identification with that to think about what information this is, support or against this particular issue. What they suggest is that in those cases, that should be a typical kind of motivated reasoning situation where my response to that is based on my existing attitudes about President Obama, and I just sort of follow along to my existing predispositions. What they suggest is that process of motivated reasoning can be disrupted. And the way you disrupt that is you prime people with their social identities, with a specific figure that is part of their in-group, and then you give them dissonant information or unexpected information to upset that normal falling back towards these political predispositions. It causes them to pause this process and rethink their positions. And they are able to show this pretty consistently with a series of experiments they did largely, or all of which were in the United States, but in different contexts within the United States. My favorite one is of Green Bay Packers fans, well, football fans, whether or not they're Green Bay Packer fans. And basically, respondents were told that Green Bay Packer Hall of Famer Leroy Butler supported marriage equality in part of this experiment. The control group was told that Jay-Z supports marriage equality. And basically, what you see is a really powerful effect here, that those getting the dissonant prime, that a Green Bay Packers Hall of Famer supports marriage equality, increase their support for same-sex marriage by more than 10 points through this experiment. Whereas those that were told that Jay-Z supports marriage equality really showed no difference. Really sort of powerful effect of this. And I think it really shows, not only for researchers, an interesting way to test this new theory, but also for activists to think about this particular issue. And a sort of final one is perspective taking. Some of you may know about the study that Broekman and Kalla did and published in Science, and the preceding controversy over the study that was withdrawn from Science. But this basic idea here is, how do we create empathy for other groups amongst people? And it suggested that if we could converse with people and make them basically put themselves in somebody else's shoes, that this might have an impact on how they perceive an issue. So what they had done was really go out into, with canvassers into the community to talk about a variety of political issues, including transgender issues. And a group of their canvassers were transgender people, and a group of their canvassers were non-transgender people. And what they did was went and had 10 to 15-minute conversations with people at their doorsteps about these issues, and they asked people to think about a time that they had been discriminated against and reflect on that and to talk about that. And that became the sort of means to generate empathy towards transgender issues. And their results, again, which are published in Science, really powerfully show that at least for transgender canvassers, and I know this is small, but I'm happy to share these slides, at least amongst transgender canvassers, they were able to generate a positive increase in support for transgender rights and affect towards transgender people. And not only did that occur in the context of the meeting, but in follow-up surveys of those individuals, that was sustained. Up to 3 months later, you could still see that effect. But the effect was just really powerful with transgender canvassers, not so powerful with non-transgender canvassers. So still a pretty amazing result, time intensive. We wanted to see, could you replicate this result in a more simple way? For example, in a nationally representative survey, could you simply ask people to pause during the survey and think about a time that they were discriminated against and then write about it? And so this is online panel data, so they were able to type out. They weren't able to leave that page for 30 seconds, so they were forced to like type something. Of course, some people write T or whatever, but they had to stay there and sort of do something. And we wanted to see if there was an effect to that, especially in the notion, could we inoculate them to negative advertising about transgender people or gain more support in association with positive advertising about transgender people. So the group was divided up. They all had to basically go through this exercise, but then roughly half the group was randomly assigned to being exposed to a negative ad from the Houston campaign against transgender, against a new ordinance in Houston. And the other half of the group was exposed to a 30-second positive campaign message from that group. And we looked for the effects there. And we weren't able to see an effect from this kind of perspective taking. We do note that we found positive effects from the positive ad and negative effects from the negative ad, but we weren't able to offset the negative ad with that perspective taking. So at least we can say, and this isn't published yet, but at least we can say that you need to do more than just ask people to think about a time they were discriminated against. It needs to be more than that. That's simply not enough. So even though that's time intensive and expensive, that's what really you have to do. So future directions. I'd say first The big future bias in all this, like I would say all of behavioral economics, a lot of political science, a lot of sociology, et cetera, is so much of what we know is about people in the United States and about people in Western countries. We know very little about whether or not these psychological theories hold up if we look to other cultures. So there's a lot to be done there. And as LGBT issues emerge in other parts of the world in a more serious way than they have in the last 20 years, as it becomes a more international kind of movement, I think these kinds of studies become all the more important. We also have to be increasingly, I think, worried about selection bias into survey samples, into focus groups, into things like that. People choosing not to participate given what they think the project is about. Now, to some extent, online surveys and online survey sampling may offset some of that. I think we also have to be increasingly worried about the bias of socially acceptable responses. In other words, people learn what's socially acceptable to say and what's not socially acceptable to say, and they give the socially acceptable response. So we're not measuring so-called actual preferences, just what people think is right. And again, I think the anonymity of online surveys might help with this, but it's a real concern, and there is some research suggesting that there's a real that bias is appearing in surveys of LGBT issues. Overall, I think with research on transgender people and policies, but I think even more importantly, our broader political psychology research, I think there's really not been much of a focus on gender nonconformity, either people's gender nonconformity as youth or gender nonconformity as adults, as well as gender conformity of subjects. And what do I mean by this? Well, there was a great study that came out in PRQ several years ago looking at voting in Australia and party preference in voting. And they were basically able to demonstrate that based on a pretty complicated set of questions about gender conformity in your youth and gender conformity as an adult, they were able to come up with a scale of gender conformity that was a better predictor of your vote choice than your sex or your party. Now, that might not be as strong in the United States, but I think the whole issue of gender conformity has really been buried under the rug. And as we think more about an issue like people's understanding of something like gender identity, his, her, or people not wanting to be categorized as either, I think really being able to sort of use this as part of our research, not only as a sort of dependent variable, but also as an independent variable, becomes more and more important. Likewise, I think thinking about sexual orientation on a spectrum, for example, when we look at the attribution research and we say, is sexual orientation something you're born with, people still want to classify you as basically gay or straight. They don't want to have anything in between. They need some kind of closure on the ends. But the reality we know is not quite like that. But very little research looks at this or its implications for politics. And as I mentioned, the whole discuss sensitivity, I think, is a really understudied and important part that going forward that we can take a look at. So thank you, and I will happily answer any of your questions, or try to.